So maybe we'll go ahead and get started. And I just want to thank everybody as you're arriving and putting your name in there. Thanks for coming out. It's already grown to larger than I thought we would have. So I'm going to ask for everybody's patience as we kind of get through this larger group. When we designed this, or when I designed this, it was intended for not so many folks. So I ask for your patience while we move through the agenda here. And we'll kick off with the sort of the ESIP housekeeping about Zoom and KikoChat. Obviously, you guys have all made it here, and most of you have been here for the meeting so far. And I would just say, if you're having troubles with Zoom or KikoChat, I know that we have the great pleasure of having Megan Carter on, KikoChat and Zoom extraordinaire. And so I would just say to feel free to touch base with Megan if you're experiencing problems. With respect to the notes, we'll put the agenda in for people who are just arriving. Let me see if I can do this and navigate at the same time. Oh, it looks like everybody's doing that for me. Great, thank you. Feel free to add to the notes as we go through the agenda. We'll capture things here. There'll be other documents to also capture notes in as well when we get into breakouts. But when we come back for the big group, we'll feel free to add content to the agenda. It should be open to everybody. Okay, the participation guidelines, the content to read as far as the guidelines is linked in the agenda here. If you haven't read it, then please go ahead and do so. There's also the link to report issues. With respect to our land acknowledgement, which we were just talking about before the session started, I have a link in the land acknowledgement that goes off to a Google Doc. I crafted a land acknowledgement for my particular location in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, which references the Mashpee Wampanoags. And Leslie is sitting in Canberra, and Shelley is in DC. And so we just like to recite this broad, sort of all-encompassing acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the lands, seas, and waters in the areas that we live, work, and meet on. We also acknowledge their continuing connection to their culture and pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And if you want to learn more about the others, feel free to hit that link. Okay, so now we can get on to the goals of the session. And this primarily is gaining consensus and socializing to the concept of a data publication workflow. Within that umbrella, we want to kind of reach a common understanding of a generalized long tail research data publication workflow and all the stakeholders involved in that and their specific roles. We'll be presenting one use case that outlines the full from researcher to publisher. And what we're going to look for is comments on that, alternate flows of that, specific repository use cases or stakeholder use cases, and then maybe document some challenges or pain points that occur during the touch points of these stakeholders in that workflow. So it sounds like a lot. We'll see how far we get. My co-chairs here are Leslie Wyborn and Shelley Stahl, and they're going to help me and kick me back into play when I go astray here. And so if there are no questions before we start, I will get into some presentations to set the stage and kind of provide you with some context and introduce the workflow that we'll all be working on in the breakouts. I will speak from BCO-DEMO, my repository. Jared Carlson is here from the University of Michigan Library and the director of Deep Blue and Research Data Services at Michigan Library. And then Shelley Stahl will be here representing AGU and sort of that affiliation public, publisher perspective. And so I will pull up, oops, let's see. I will try and pull up and share screen here. And see how this goes. All right, can you guys see my screen? Maybe?
Yes, we see your screen.
Except, I apologize. Maybe. Yeah, this is
I feel weirdly backwards.
yeah, let me see if I can stop for a moment and find my screen here. Apologies, everyone.
So maybe while you're looking that up, Danny, I'll mention, because I keep getting this question individually, if you're like Jeff trying to watch multiple sessions at a time, all of the sessions are being recorded and they will be posted to the Sketch page for the meeting on the individual session pages. And that'll be sort of in the next few weeks. It takes a little time to process, but if there's anything you are so excited you can't wait for it, let me know.
Thank you, Megan. And let's try this one again. Slowly but surely, we'll get there. All right. Can you all see a title slide? All right, great. Okay, so what we're getting at here is trying to socialize the concept of this workflow, because we're experiencing on the repository side and definitely on the publisher side some pain points between the touch points in the workflow to publish data. And so why do we need this? Why specifically? So the importance of the data supporting scholarly publications is increasing, yet the act of publishing data on the side of the repository and also the infrastructure that supports that has grown organically, becoming more formalized in terms of repository space, but really grew over decades time working with the research community. Domain and institutional repositories are kind of experiencing some challenges to fit into this new paradigm of data publication in with the journals. And so this is creating bottlenecks and some other challenges on the stakeholder side in terms of researcher, repository, and journal. And yet in this paradigm, there's been little awareness and communication across the stakeholders. And so this is getting at trying to build consensus of what this picture looks like, and also to use this workflow as a tool to serve, to communicate and collaboratively arrive at some solutions. So a little bit of history on this specific workflow. It originally started in this sort of seed conversations of the Council of Data Facilities back in February 2020, where we had some webinars trying to bring publishers and repositories closer together on emerging topics. The concept of a workflow to kind of communicate these pain points that we are identifying was socialized at ESIP 2020 summer meeting through a Coptis session. We then did this more formally at RDA at the Virtual Plenary 16 through the ESID working group. And what came out of that was, hey, there is an RDA WDS publishing data workflows interest group already, and they've already done this. And so we're acknowledging that, and it's very good work. But for this particular problem, I found that workflow was rather high level and general, and didn't get down into the pain points. It's also sort of looking at an idealized situation, and does it kind of take into account what's actually on the ground and happening. So I kind of crafted this, or together with Shelley and Leslie, we've been working on this. And so we continue to refine it. We shared it at fall meeting again at AGU, and now we hope to kind of pitch it to a broader audience to get some more feedback and alternate use cases, and maybe getting into some of those pain points and documenting them. So that's sort of the nuts and bolts and how we got here. A few things about this, so you'll get to see it shortly in the breakout rooms. A few considerations to keep in mind. One is that the focus is on geoscience observational data, not samples or code. We needed to constrain it just to get to what the pain points are associated with new submissions of data. So it's not looking at reuse. It's also not going to look at operational or streaming data, but primarily domain-specific long-tail data streams that are newly submitted and supporting publications. It's more than likely incomplete. This is why we're kind of pitching it to you guys to see if, excuse me, all of you, to see if what's missing, what could be added, what needs to be added to represent your specific workflow. And so the rest of the session is going to kind of look like this. We're going to have a series of really quick speakers, myself representing BecoDemo, Jake representing Deep Blue, and Shelley representing AGU. Then we're going to go into breakouts. There'll be 2 components to the breakouts. You can stay in the same breakout together. I'll give you more information on that later, and then we'll come back together and discuss any big takeaways and go from there. So I will ask Shelley or Leslie, is there anything else we want to add here before we go into the talks?
I'm fine.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start with an introduction really quickly of the Biological and Chemical Oceanography Data Management Office, or BecoDemo. Many of you on the call are very familiar with BecoDemo, so I'm going to kind of run through this and get to really the specific reason why I felt we needed this particular workflow. So BecoDemo is NSF-supported domain-specific repository working with researchers in ocean ecosystem dynamics. They submit data to us. We do a number of activities to curate those and publish them online with the DOI, and then submit them to an archive. We reside at Woods Hole Oceanographic. We have highly heterogeneous data streams, and some of our, all of our activities for curation sort of focus on a generic data lifecycle. You can see here some of the activities that we engage in as a domain-specific repository. So we help with data management planning. We use domain knowledge to crack open files. We harmonize formats. We dig into normalizing observational precisions, gross quality control. We create domain-specific metadata. We apply licensing and DOIs, we create citations, and we also document provenance and keep track of versions. We do all these activities through the employment of emerging technologies and community best practices and standards. And we also do some education on the oceanographic community to kind of build data management capacity within their research workflows. And down below, you see our staff, and they do a lot of hand-holding. And now I'll come to really the pain point for us. And this is an actual anonymized email to sort of a power user of BecoDemo. And I'll just read it really quickly. Please find the attached data for my next paper that has just been accepted to Journal X. And in the zip file, you'll find the draft of the manuscript, which is an Excel file that had, in this particular case, 7 or 8 disparate data sets and our metadata forms. And he said, I imagine we'll have a few weeks before I need to do anything with Journal X. Historically, they're much slower than Journal Y. We're in good shape, right? It would be great to publish this paper with the data set DOIs. I'll keep you posted. And then, well, okay, so a few things to note here. This person is only submitting data relevant to the paper, right? For us, we want the whole corpus of the project output. Data are getting submitted after the manuscript's done. So it's already been to the publisher, to the journal. And so now we're racing to get those 8 data sets published. And yet we don't know what the time requirement is. And this is one individual, and I would say that each year we deal with thousands of data sets coming from hundreds of PIs. So that was, and I would draw your attention to the date here. It's the 7th of this month, right? On the 9th, ugh, the proofs arrived. And much to my surprise, right? What do I do, right? Is it feasible to add the DOIs now? Are you done yet? Can you get them done in time? I'm so sorry. So our response to this is, you know, we will try to do our best. The odds are we're not going to make any kind of deadline. We still don't quite know when he needs them, even though he's gotten notification. We're still not sure what the timeline is for the hard sell and the DOIs. So we give him that response. We'll do our best. And what comes in on the 10th is, no worries, it's not a reasonable request, but what would we do if I just requested the DOIs for you guys and then submit the paper and risk that it gets rejected? But so there's a whole lot to unpack there in terms of what's getting submitted, the order of operations, the pressure to reach these unknown timelines. And then the expectations are different from PI to repository to journal. And yet there hasn't been very much communication across them. So from my perspective of a domain-specific repository, how do we encourage the full project output submission and yet get the journals what they need for just the scholarly publication? How do we get them to submit that once you've done your analyses, once you've organized your data in the way you would conduct your analysis? Submit it when it's research ready, not when your manuscript is done and off to the journal. And then how do we better align what the needs are for the journal in terms of looking at the data for just table 1 versus the whole corpus of project output? And then in addition to that, manage other needs of the publishers while providing time to curate those data robustly. So that's my pain point from my repository perspective. And I think what we'll do here is Jake will get to speak next, and then we can, and then Shelley, and then we can have a brief moment for, or a couple minutes for Q&A before we move into the breakouts. And if that sounds okay, and Jake, you are ready, I can cue you up here.
I'm ready. Thanks for driving. I'm assuming you're going to advance the slides for me.
I will.
Awesome, thanks. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So my name is Jake Carlson. As mentioned, I really want to thank Shelley, Danny, and Leslie for inviting me here to present sort of the institutional repository view of the world and the pain points that we have in operating our services. So I oversee a mighty team of 4, and we oversee both Deep Blue and Deep Blue Data. Deep Blue is our institutional repository, and Deep Blue Data focuses explicitly on data. Next slide, please. So a little bit about what we do. One of our missions is to provide a means for the University of Michigan community to make their work openly accessible. So things that they've already published, can we use our repository as a means to publish preprints and other things that they're openly accessible to the larger well, throughout the world, really. And so you can see this is a research article published by a graduate student at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. And if you didn't have access to this particular journal, you didn't have access to a library that's subscribed, you'd have to pay $30 to get this particular paper. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And so here's a record of the preprint in Deep Blue. Again, open, accessible to anybody. Go ahead to the next slide, please. The other thing that we do is to provide a means of publishing non-traditional content. So content that has scholarly value or educational value, but doesn't have a natural sort of course of publication. And in particular, that focuses on research data. So back to Terry Ruiz from University of Michigan, we have the data set that lies beneath the article that he published. And we can connect that to our record in Deep Blue so that if you find the article, you can find the data set and vice versa. Next slide, please. So the Deep Blue repositories, everything that we deposit is assigned a unique identifier, a DOI in Deep Blue Data, or a handle in Deep Blue. We are indexed by Google and other search engines. Discovery is a really important part of the work that we do and the services we provide. And we offer basic preservation for all formats. We can do some advanced preservation depending upon the different types of formats. If it's open, we can give a larger commitment to preserving the work that go into the repositories. Next slide, please. So we find that, and this certainly is not news to any of you, that sharing data is really hard to do. Researchers don't often have a sense as to what really goes into making a data set, not just putting it out on the web for anybody to get at, but to really make it shareable and usable and trustworthy to other folks. It may not be easy for people to understand, to trust, or to use the data. It may not be clear to researchers how to prepare that data for others to reuse. And it really requires an investment of time and attention, not just at the point where they're ready to publish it, but throughout the research lifecycle to make it something that can really serve as a good scholarly object for others to interact with. Next slide, please. And so, one of the challenges that we have as an institutional repository, we serve the University of Michigan, and the University of Michigan has 19 different colleges and a number of different departments within each of those colleges, which makes life a little tough. But one of the things that we do, and we do, I think, pretty well, is to focus on the researcher themselves, to try to understand as best we can their particular data lifecycle and what they're trying to accomplish through the work and who the audiences might be. Again, to help sort of inform and prepare the data set for later dissemination. Next slide, please. So our services, we're really focused on not just at the point of publication, of receiving it, but working with researchers, consulting, providing education on the data management plan at the beginning of the life cycle, but on metadata, documentation, contextual information throughout the life cycle, how the data set might be organized or structured to best enable somebody else to make use of it and to understand it. And then to think about the repository that they might use, or where does the data set best belong that it could reach the intended audience that would make the most use of it. So that in some cases that may not be Deep Blue. It may be domain repositories that are out there, in which case we'll help researchers consider which repository to put it in and how to best prepare that data for its eventual submission. Next slide, please. If we do get a deposit to Deep Blue, we have separate processes for documents and for data, and they're sort of described here. But there are some similarities. So we are looking for metadata from both documents and data sets. So some contextual information about the work, enough to cite it, enough to understand it. We want the files for sure. That's the next step in the process. For data, a licensing agreement is required, and we have people select from different options, or if they have another option, they can submit it to us and we'll review it to be sure that it meets our particular criteria and our value of openness. For docs, a license set is not required because the person submitting a preprint, for example, may not have the authority to assign a license. We have people agree to terms of use. And then in the case of documents, the published item, the item itself will go live at this particular point. It's unmediated. For data, though, that the submitting of the data set to our repository is the first step. Next slide, please. There we go. So once we get a data set, we'll conduct a review of it. We do an initial review to see, is this in fact something that meets our requirements for deposit, our collection policy? Is it in fact a data set? Is there sensitive data attached to it? Is there any documentation attached to it? And unfortunately, that happens more than I'd like, that there is in fact no documentation that comes with the data set. Once it passes that initial review, we'll decide, do we want to review it ourselves, or will we pass it off to the Data Curation Network? The Data Curation Network is a group of 11 academic library data repositories and Data Dryad as a generalist repository that we can make use of in reviewing data sets. There may be expertise at a different university that we don't have, and so to do a more thorough or more effective curation review, we may send it off to a curator at one of these institutions that has expertise. It's also a means for us, it's sort of an escape valve, right? If we are besieged with data sets and we know that we're not going to be able to get to these things as quickly as we'd like to, we have the Data Curation Network to send off our data set to be reviewed by a curator at a different university. And we operate in the same capacity for members as well. They can send us data sets to review and then to send back to them to deposit in their repositories. Our review consists of sort of three overarching areas. We will review the data files themselves. We'll take a look to see, do we have questions with regards to structures? Are there missing cells? Are there sort of obvious outliers that we might have questions about? We will look at the context of the data set, the README file, the code book, things that give the data set meaning. We sort of view this as an instruction manual for the data set. And so we will try to walk through and understand what it is that we have in front of us using the README file, and to see if we have places where there might be gaps or where information, there might need to be more information. We'll also take a look at the organization or the cohesion of the data set review. So a data set is more than just one file. It's at least a file and a README, but oftentimes we get tens, hundreds, thousands, sometimes even more than that files. Are these things labeled and grouped in ways where you can understand what a particular group of files is all about and how it relates or connects to the larger data set? Once we've done that particular process, we will either get our recommendations from the curator at the Data Creation Network, or we'll draft our own set of recommendations, and we'll begin a negotiation process for making changes to the data set to improve it and to improve its discoverability, trust, and usability, hopefully. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And so we will send that list of recommendations to the depositor for negotiation to hopefully get either them to make those changes or to give us permission to make the changes on their behalf. Once that process is done, the DOI is minted, although I should say, as Danny noted, there are times when a DOI is requested earlier. I think we're very much in the same situation of that. Different researchers, different depositors will want different things from us at different times for different reasons, depending on the publisher. One of our big challenges is that we never directly interact with the publisher themselves. And so we're sort of relying on the researcher to convey what is needed from the publisher, what they need to get the data set through, and to connect it with the article that they're going from with the publisher. And so that can get a little challenging and a little frustrating because, again, as Danny said, it's never quite the same thing twice, right? Like there's different things going on for different reasons, and we have to figure out how to accommodate those as best we can, given the tools and the time that we have to work on this particular data set. Next slide. So this is sort of a zoomed out view of the workflow that we've got, again, of trying to work with them as much as closely as we can throughout the life cycle, at the point of deposit, going through the process and having them give us the information we need to put forth a publishable data set, and then doing the review to be sure that the data set has the value that it could have, and to make it the best published data set that we possibly can, and then going through the review process and negotiating with the researcher. And I think that brings me to the end of my particular part of the presentation.
I think that's right. Thank you, Jake. Let's see. Next, oops, I jumped ahead to Leslie. Are you, excuse me, Shelley, are you all set to go?
I am all set to go. I'm going to be
Great.
really short because I think having be a regular participant here at ESIP, you know a lot of the thoughts that we have happening in journals. So specific for this session, if you could go to the next slide.
Oops. Yeah, bear with me here.
At AGU, we've been working really hard to try to demystify this connection between our journals and repositories like Danny's, like Jake's. And I also want to note that Zolt Silberer is on from the Ecological Society of America as part of their journal community. And Mike Friedman is here. I think you're still here from the American Meteorological Society, as well as Brooks Hansen from AGU. So we represent your journal community on this conversation. We realize we're outnumbered, but we hope as we can really support this conversation to better connect between the timelines happening within journals and the timelines happening within repositories, and help our own community be more aware of the common need, and that this ability to communicate better would be helpful. So as we've been building journal-specific guidelines at AGU, and these are for data where we've been targeting closer understanding of what repositories need and when those requirements happen. Certainly, at the time of publication is not optimal. for an author to reach out to a domain repository and say, hey, could you preserve my data? We know that. So working together with you to get earlier in the life cycle. And with some jealousy, I note that because Jake's at a university, he's able to have some connection to researchers earlier, and it would be great to foster that communication even further. I think I think we're all jealous of that connection. But as a journal, we try to make sure that there's an optimal selection for where the data goes. And still the most common questions we get are what data and where do you want me to preserve it? And this is just crazy common still. So we try to guide. It's hard, and other people are working on tools for this, and we're happy to use them. And then connecting the author to you. That is the better answer than you don't want to talk to the journal about this. You want the author to talk to you directly. And get the most support possible for whatever curation forms. Danny mentioned the forms to get metadata. And then the third bullet there is helping the author realize timing. Like for instance, I hope Pangaea is through this, but Pangaea had a huge backlog because they were changing their submission infrastructure just months. And it really blew back at us at the journal side, where authors were telling us, listen, we're used to just throwing our data at Pangaea and they've been dealing with it. And now they're telling us it's going to be months. And so that's an extreme situation, but nonetheless, knowing that, you need so many months ahead in order to prepare or weeks, and the authors need to know that. At the time of publication, it's a little late, but they'll publish again. So maybe they can build it into their plan next time. And then there's been an interesting conversation in chat about reserved DOIs. Share links are another option. Share links allow for peer review to happen, and that's something that's really important for journals. We have at AGU, we've got single blind peer review. Others have double blind. And having a repository able to support that's really important. So so letting the author know what to expect with the process with that particular repository, and that not every repository does it the same way or can do it the same way. And we have a variety of workarounds to make sure that is possible. And then just general information to help the author know what to expect as they move forward in the process. Next slide. Keeping it really simple on the journal side, we certainly prefer a persistent identifier in order to provide citation. So aside from things that are covered under, say, a core trust seal certification or a number of other repository recommendations, the two that tend to be left out are we do expect that the repository keep the peer reviewer identity confidential. Keep in mind, you probably have access to the IP address. You could probably figure out where that person's from. But what we want you to do is actually keep it confidential so that we can maintain that through the publication process. And there are very few repositories that can support double blind. Taylor and Francis, for instance, uses double blind, and they're challenged with working with repositories. So access and keeping the identities confidential. So that's all I have on the journal side. I'm really excited that we're trying to think this through. This is difficult, and it's certainly not the same between repository to repository, journal to journal. So it would be good to work through these details. Thanks, Danny. One moment, Zolt or Mike, do you have anything to add that I might have missed? Or Brooks?
Hello. Yeah, no, I don't have anything specific to add, because I can very much understand sort of the same issue that Shelley's been talking about. The regular question we have is, where do I deposit it? How much does it cost, which is another big one, because they're not always accounting for the cost. And then the nuances of, well, if the data is confidential, how do I deal with it? If it's IRB, if it's other situations, what I do now? So there are a plethora of issues that we go through, and I think the biggest issue we have is that we just don't have anywhere to send folks. That is, we send them to our FAQs, but there isn't a source for authors or researchers to go to and say, look, this is a definitive source. This is where you can go to, and I think that's a big gap for us in this space.
Yeah,
this is Mike, and I just I don't have too much more to add to that, but a big piece for us, since we're I think a little bit behind where certainly where you are, Shelley, at AGU, is really working out who's responsible for what and educating not only the authors, but the editors and reviewers too. And, that's still an open discussion with us. And the other challenge I would say is, because this whole area is evolving so rapidly, guidelines have to keep up. And so if they're always changing, there's always more education to do. So that's been a challenge as well.
Thanks, Mike. Yep. We have, and I'm sure Zolt does too, it's really hard to keep the editors all on the same page. The data is different, the challenges are different, the questions from authors are different. It's hard.
Oops. Thanks, you guys. I appreciate the extra context and comments there. We're just a little over where I was hoping we'd be to go into the breakouts, but I also wanted to see if anybody had any questions on the presentations right now. Maybe one or two quick questions there, and then we'll move into the breakouts.
Yeah, this is Madison Langseth. I put a question in the chat about the double-blind peer review, and maybe this is too much to get into, but do we know of any repositories that are able to successfully support that? Because I know in our case, our metadata always includes contact information. So how do you obscure that from the reviewers?
Yeah, I would definitely take that one off our table, Madison, because that's a whole rabbit hole there. But I can tell you that Dryad can do it. And maybe what we can do is ask Daniela to explain that to us in a follow-up conversation.
Okay, yeah. Thanks.
Great. Any other follow-on questions? I'm sorry I haven't been able to steer and look at the chat, but maybe if either Shelley or Leslie see anything that jumps out through the chat, we can grab one there.
We are seeing some, we have pretty much everyone on the call is running into these same problems. So we hit a good topic, Danny. And some folks have pieces that are working for them. So I think if we head to Breakout, we'll be able to capture those.
Yeah, okay, great. All right,
Danny, my only comment was, please, will the ESIP support group make sure we capture this chat, because it's going to take a little while to work through.
Absolutely, and I think we can,
in it.
Yeah, Leslie, I think we can cut and paste it at the bottom here at the very end, because we'll still be rolling. Is that right, Megan?
Yeah,
okay.
I'll make sure
ESIP fellow's going to do that. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Okay, so let's see, how many folks are we here? 60. Oh, that's actually great. So Megan, I think what we want to do is use all 6 rooms.
Yes.
And so going into the breakouts, we'll have, I think we can kind of maybe go on the 30-minute side and see where we are. With so many people, I don't think we'll be able to have a discussion for when we come back together, but we might be able to list the top takeaway from each breakout room. Because there are 60 folks on the call, I think we're going to do 6 rooms. I was capable of quickly adding some before the session started, given how many people were looking to join us. So I think we're going to move.
If it's possible to put the publisher folks in different rooms so that we can help the conversation. I know there's not 6 of us, but maybe
Can you all identify yourself some way in your name that Megan can see? Or Megan, is that possible to
Yeah,
hit
if you can
select
rename yourself and add
publisher?
Okay, add pub at the front.
Right, add pub. And okay, so going into the breakouts, while you guys are doing that, I will say the rest of you will be randomly assigned. There'll be 6 rooms. When you arrive there, please designate somebody to do the report out, even if you're all contributing to the notes and the Jamboard. I think that's great. But when we come back together, one person is going to give kind of the either the mic or the task of writing your single takeaway. We'll have 2 tasks. Each will get 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how much your group is engaged. There's going to be a breakout Jamboard, and it's going to look similar to that image that you all see in the agenda. And there will be one Jamboard slide for each breakout room. So go to your slide, and there you will see the workflow. And it's rather large. You may have to enlarge it to see the individual components, but get yourself oriented. And then what would be great is if you can use that frame that corresponds to your breakout group to annotate using all the tools in Jamboard. And put down things that you note that are missing or need some editing or general comments on it. Are we missing something big? That's the first task. And I will say, if you scroll down a little more in the agenda, you'll see the Jamboard for the link to your specific room when you're there, when you're ready, when you get your number. Keep the agenda up. We'll put that back in the chat. And the second part of this, in the last 10 to 15 minutes, is a Google Doc link under your breakout group that will have 2 questions. Do you have an alternate flow? If you're a repository in the group, do you have an alternate flow for how this would go down, or added pieces to this, or challenges that you can identify? So where are the pain points for you? Maybe it's that DOI. We don't have the capacity to initiate a handle in terms of, or a pre-DOI, or maybe it's the timing of the handoff. I know somebody recently said, I don't have they didn't see a line going back to the repository with the publication confirmation to the repository to match the DOI in the paper. Just any kind of comments that you have in terms of pain points and alternate flows can go in that Google Doc. And then when we pull you all back, we can have the scribes put down the one biggest takeaway of all of that exercise. And then maybe we can go through that if there's time. If not, we'll just have a quick discussion before we adjourn. Okay. If everybody's good to go, or if anybody has any questions, we can speak now. And we'll do the forever hold your peace.
And Megan, I'm going to also nominate Peter Fox as a publisher person who could help with this. I see him marking himself as editor. I would call that out as someone who could hold on to the pub's conversation for us.
All right.
What?
Oh,
Yeah, Peter knows
Come on,
everything.
Peter, play along.
What?
Oh, come on, man. You labeled yourself.
All right, I'm going to open the rooms up.
I'm an editor, not a publisher.
You have 25 minutes. Danny, is that a good length of time? And then we'll reconvene.
That sounds good.
All right. Have fun,
Thank you.
everyone. Come back to the main room if you get lost or need any help. Dawn, they just went into breakout rooms. Let's see. Let me assign you.
Okay.
Thank you, Megan. Y'all arriving back. How did everyone do? Silent.
To me, it'll
Good
be
discussion.
interesting to see where each group has their sticky notes, because then we'll know where the most controversial or weakest parts of the workflow are.
I agree, definitely. Let's see. So we only have about 15 total minutes left for this session, right? So I think what would be great is if, let's see, we can at least give everyone a minute or two to type out your group scribe, to type your largest conversation topic or your biggest takeaway, and the agenda again has a spot for that. Under each breakout, if you had a note taker, feel free to put that in there, and then maybe we could at least go around the room and have a minute for those people to kind of speak about that. And we'll give everybody a second to put their notes in there. It was great conversations, and it was great to hear. We had enough repositories on there that had a wide variety of alternate flows in pieces of it, not so much the whole thing, but and one of the challenges I will say that we struggled with when we were all making this was the role of the data management plan and how this will impact the workflow, and the recognition that the data management plan has lots of potential, but is certainly not nowhere near realizing that potential at this time, unfortunately. Okay. This is looking great. Thank you, guys. We see Breakout 3 and Breakout 4. Let's see if you guys can quickly.
So Danny, I added it to the Google main notes. We actually didn't put sticky notes up, but it's on the Google for group 4. There's some notes on the Google Doc for group 4.
Okay. Can you do me a favor? I didn't even see who this is. Oh, it's Brooks. Can you do me a favor and just pull whatever you feel is the main point that you would want to just share?
I did. I put that in right below group 4. Where am I supposed to put it?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll go up and paste it. It's okay.
Oh, down there. Okay.
No, it's okay. I'm sorry. I thought you meant it was still in the Google Doc.
No, it's that.
I mean, in the group, you were 4, Brooks?
Yeah.
Great.
You're
okay, there.
Great. Thank you.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't follow you at first. I apologize.
Likewise.
All right. It looks like some folks have great content. That's awesome to share. So let's just do really quickly around the group breakout room horn here, and start with breakout group 1 and see if anybody wants to share any specific comments around your takeaway.
Shelley here. We had a really good team, lots of thoughtful communication. Challenges I didn't, so even more work, Danny, for all of us. But the biggest takeaway was that better communication between journals and repositories. So essentially this task that we're working through right now, if journals could communicate better with repositories on what's needed, the expectation, we can deal better with expectations, plan, and any upcoming challenges. And I think as a journal, representing a journal, I would also be very sensitive and say we as journals need to be more sensitive to what repositories need, and support the communication to authors that the DMP matters, and communicating with your repository early matters, and advocate in that way.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. It'd be great to know what those great laserly focused means of communications between stakeholders would be. What is that? What does that look like? You know, that's like, I feel like the holy grail here. Cool, thank you. Breakout 2. I see the catch-22 under your title there. Oh, maybe we lost our. Is anybody from Breakout 2 want to talk about their big takeaway?
Somebody put that as a summary on the bottom of ours, and I copied it over. So I don't know if they want to speak up, but we talked quite a bit about the cycle of like needing the DOI for the data set early, but then also needing the DOI for the publication, and then linking it back to the data set DOI, and like how do we automate that to make sure that that bidirectional referencing is done well. We talked a little bit about at the end, just sort of figuring out how to do landing pages or something that might have a single DOI for a collection of a bunch of different data types that are brought together and synthesized for this, you know, conceptual paper that somebody is trying to pull a bunch of information from, and where does that live, and who's in charge of making it, and when, how does that work? So, but I think having a one-to-one reference of like, these are the data for this publication might ease that communication between Crossref and data site and various other places where that recognition for the data set sometimes gets lost in that daisy chain of citations.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Alicia. I have to say, I love your I love that you're wearing a puffer and you're in front of your backdrop that just looks very warm and inviting. Thanks for being the spokesperson. Those are great. Breakout 3. I see more reference
I guess
to the DMP.
I could jump in. I can jump in here, and I think it's challenging if there's a single box for the DMP, because DMP is kind of different things to different people. And Danny, you raised this, like at the proposal stage, it's really something that is being considered in terms of the overall plan of the project. And, you know, it's important to consider, has the PI, you know, appropriately communicated with the repository and determine the feasibility of that place where they're going to put their data. But projects change over time. And so then, you know, assuming a project goes forward, the DMP can then perhaps serve as a living, actionable document that evolves as the project evolves, and can be kind of the point of intersection between the researcher and the repository or repositories that they're working with.
Yeah, I appreciate that. There are a couple groups, both in Research Data Alliance and I think an NSF supported group with Data Dryad, that are looking at machine actionable, or maybe California Digital, that are looking at machine actionable living types of DMPs. I don't think we're quite there yet. I think that's actively going on, but I think that kind of, it certainly is promising to see the recognition of the importance in that DMP. Thanks, Raleigh. Breakout group 4.
So I think I can summarize, and most of it's there. It would be useful to have some relative timelines on that diagram, and some of the steps are much more important than others. We already talked about the DMP step. So we had a lot of other discussion that's in the Google Doc, but that's a kind of takeaway to help communicate the importance of some of these steps.
Can I ask you to elaborate on what timeframes you're talking about? Is that like how the processing time for a data set, or the need of the publisher?
Yes to both. So I've had in my career papers published in 6 days to never.
Wow.
So, you know, so 6 days to infinity. But, you know, many papers get published after a month and a half. So that's the time frame that an author, reviewer, publisher could be working on. You know, that's probably at the short end. But, you know, certainly, you know, Science, Nature, GRL is an example of kind of the median time is about 4 or 5 weeks from submission to publication, with a longer tail. And then so having the same kind of information for repositories. So, you know, if you have a paper that needs to be published in 6 days because it's so competitive, and, you know, usually there's a few papers like that journals will pull out all the stops for. But then that kind of adds in the importance of working with the repository even sooner.
Yeah, I like that. So I wish as a repository, I could have a data set takes this long to give back to you guys. I find they're all over the place depending on what kind of shape we get them in, and the level of curation that you're doing at the observational level versus, you know, if you're a sort of a generalist and you don't crack open files or apply any curation.
So we talked a little bit about that, exactly.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, let's see. 5, I think.
So
Bruce
riffing
was-
off that last comment, actually, Deb Johnny Singh, who works at the Ornell DAC, is working on a paper around some of those questions. And the single biggest factor that determines how long is how many emails do we have to send back and forth with the data provider to clarify. I put our summary in here. I think a key point to add is that some repositories have to include a step that basically says, do we have the authority to be able to accept this data? And that's something that only happens once, and then we iterate with the data provider. There was some comment about managing the whole revision process, both in the initial submission, after publication, for a variety of reasons, and then some discussion around granularity of DOIs and when do DOIs change, and that's a religious war.
So Bruce, that's funny. I was multitasking a little bit in dealing with a potential retraction at AGU because the employer did not give the author permission to send their paper in QED, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Case
so
in
for
point.
us, if it's not NASA funded, I have to do a pretty serious mother may I.
Yeah, these are all great things, and I hope that the sticky notes and notes documents are adding up here. Okay, the last breakout, 6.
Sure,
Feel free
I can say a few words here. I think we had a lot of similar conversations that other groups had, so I won't reiterate those. I think the one thing that maybe was a little different, or that I didn't hear mentioned, was what, something that's missing from the workflow is what happens when a paper is rejected, so it's not actually published. Yeah, just what happens within the repository to the data.
Great, thanks, Madison.
Danny, if I could I
Yeah.
say something about that, because I've heard this a couple of times about, and there's in my view, at least as a repository person, a little bit of a misperception that data that are in the repository that don't necessarily have some kind of directly related publication still may have lots and lots of value. And what we find is the unexpected reuse of data that may have never had anything ever published about it until somebody discovered it through one of our discovery tools or something like that, and reused it in ways we never would have expected it to be reused. And we heard some of that, I think, in one of the plenary sessions or one of the other sessions I think I've been at this week, where some drought data or something that was acquired from NOAA was used in planning Japanese road system improvements or something as sort of the basis for model, or things like that are serendipitous sometimes, and we lose, not having stuff in libraries where you can just wander around in the stacks and discover things by accident can be a useful thing too. So I wouldn't necessarily think it's wasted effort by the repositories.
Now, I mean, so this was me who put this into the discussion. The issue is that people want the data to be deleted. They want to reuse it for the next publication, for a new try in using their data. So, we would be happy to keep it, but what happens is that they say, can you please delete what you have? And we're losing out on the effort that we've put into the curation so far. And we have no way in insisting at the moment the data has to stay with us for public access because it was submitted as part of a paper. So that's
really interesting, Kirsten. I haven't heard of that that scenario. but I would say that one of the things we're challenged with is something very similar in that we get piecemeal data out of a project based on the table in a publication rather than the whole corpus of the project output. And that's a big challenge because what we want to do is capture, as Dawn was saying, that we don't presume to know the value of those data going forward in their reuse, and we want to capture the whole corpus of a project effort. And yet people are giving us just the table one, and yet we know, or this was the successful data that went into this publication, and I have a bunch of other project data that we
yeah,
haven't
I mean,
submitted.
that's another big challenge. I think, and I put a comment in earlier that, in geochemistry, the data are acquired, data of a project are acquired over time and in different labs. And there are different publications coming out for a given project. So coordinating all that and having all the data out at the same time, so to say, submitted at least at the same time would be, yeah, I would assume close to impossible in our community.
So this is Payne. I wonder a related question would be whether we should post something on the notes on the website to the data not published yet. It says under review, because then people will know if you have, let's say NCEI have a data on their website, everything is operational. Other repository may not. I wonder whether we should have something along that line to let users know some of the data sets are still under review, some are already being published and through peer review.
The metadata record should be able to communicate that information. You don't have to submit the data for archiving before the metadata record itself. So just communicating that it exists is half the battle, like you said.
Yeah, we actually don't produce a metadata record until the data sets are near finalized, and we make sure that the final data product that we end up with, however many data sets we end up with, are accurate, and then we'll create the metadata. But I also think that we're trying to get to a model where we communicate with the PI like a journal would communicate. Now you're in review, now you're in acceptance, now it'll be approximately 2 weeks, and then you'll get another notice. And we're not there yet, but that's something we're hoping for.
If the data has been already deposited into your repository, it should be, on a resubmission, the work's already been done. So it is a bit strange to delete it, or if it's in a private mode in the repository.
So yeah, I appreciate that, Nick. I agree. It is strange. So I want to acknowledge that we're at the end of the session time. We got there really quickly, and I want to thank all of our speakers, and I want to thank all of our attendees for all your good output. And I will say, stay tuned. If you can stay with us for another minute, I didn't capture our takeaways, but the 3 overarching for the session, and I would be happy to jot something down here if people shouted out one. I have some that I think are takeaways. Communication sounded like a big one between stakeholders, but if anybody is interested in getting their top takeaway for the session down here, I'd be happy to entertain typing that. Otherwise, I want to thank everyone for your time in this session. On behalf of the co-chairs, I want to thank Jake as being our added speaker, and thank you all for coming.
Danny, there was one thing too that came across for Team 1, and that is whatever we do, we need to communicate this to all the journals. So I definitely, whatever comes out, we can propagate.
That's great. I also heard that DMPs are. Go ahead, Bruce. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, because you can get all of the journals to agree, just like you can get all of the repositories to agree.
Well, strangely, journals have a precedent. Journals have a precedent, and they frankly don't like figuring stuff out on their own. So it has a shot.
Yep.
So I also heard DMPs are playing a big role here, And yet we didn't really give them more than a box in our workflow because it just seems so onerous.
But there's also a lot of variation because some people don't have DMPs. And unfortunately, DMPs can sometimes be write once, read never.
Yeah, yeah,
And
like
then
Raleigh was
reality
indicating.
changes between
Yeah.
when the DMP was written, so it does get updated.
Yeah, I
Jake,
agree.
thanks so
I think
much.
that living document needs to happen.
Great
Any other
session.
takeaways as those few people are still with us?
Yeah, I think the need for early communication is critical. You know, before the article is accepted, way
Before it's submitted, please.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah.
Submitted.
after
Maybe,
it's accepted.
maybe that's the next sticker that we make, you know, gonna publish, you know, where's your data?
And we're working on, we have API now for our data repository where if people can put their data in the repository as they're collecting it. So that's what we're sort of hoping in the long run, is that their data will just be there already. And then when they have a paper, they can, it's like no work. It'll be something they don't have to think about. So they can upload and download and so on. When it's private, there's no versioning or whatever. And then when they publish it, it's a version. So we haven't got anybody really working on that yet, but we've, you know, we have.
I really like that. I think so far we've been talking about requirement for scientists, requirement for repository, requirement for journals. I think making things efficient, because the more paperwork, like more DMPs and all that stuff, it just add additional workload to scientists. And that is not their primary focus. I'm not saying they are not useful, and I feel like the scientists are underrepresented, so I'm kind of jump out because I have been both on both sides, publishing and receiving papers. So I think that's the key. So make it a nice workflow, runs smoothly for everybody. Communicating probably would help the like reduce some of the issues. The communication, like the when people say, oh, the scientist needs to start early, and then I think underlying question is, have you communicated to scientists to start early? Have you communicated to scientists there are tools that would help them to do better and to help repository do their work better?
We've just started to coordinate, or at least start a dialogue with those people who develop or operate tools to, you know, support lab data acquisition, to support field data acquisition, and build, you know, what I call the pipeline from the field to the archive, you know. So we need those connections between different systems to make it easy to transfer the data throughout, you know, capture metadata and then transfer the data in an easy and manageable way.
Yeah.
I want to note too that Leslie put a great comment in the chat that, you know, this section of capturing these big takeaways was really what should we do for our next steps? And although I do agree with, you know, some of these are statements and others are actions and action items, but what she called out was to continue this effort through the ESIP Coptus cluster, which I think is entirely, you know, appropriate and a good.
It kind of goes without saying, but I think it is a takeaway that there's a ton of energy based on, you can see people showing up that this is something they care strongly about, and I think that needs to be a takeaway.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone. I realize we're way over our 5:30, so I appreciate everybody sticking on to the bitter end here and all your contributions.